Okay, welcome guys. Today we start talking about what is called the Industrial Revolution. Let's get some basics out of the way first of all. Okay, when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, what we're talking about is the 18th century. We're talking about Britain, Great Britain. The first industrialized nation in the world is Great Britain. Now, how do you define this? Industrialization is essentially when humanity switched from being essentially farmers, agrarian lifestyles, to urban, industrialized factories, mass production. It is when we began to mass produce items. We did so through using low cost saving machinery. So industrialization is essentially when we began to use machines to replace humanity to produce more. Mass production, instead of one shirt in a day, you can make 1,000 shirts in a day, is going to be followed by mass consumerism. Instead of owning 2 shirts, you now own 10 shirts, and you got to consume as much as possible in order to buy all the produced items. Up into the 18th century, humanity lived pretty much the same way all over the world. There were some skilled workers, there were people who had trades and carpenters and such, but pretty much up to the 18th century, everybody was essentially farmers. Even if you had another job, you often had a farm also to produce food and so forth. In the 18th century, a number of different items occurred in Britain that will create the atmosphere that will be an environment for the Industrial Revolution to take place. You need essentially 3 things to become an industrialized nation. You need a fuel, something used that can be used in industry and factories for machines. You need cheap labor. You need a lot of people that are willing to be paid very little and live a low lifestyle standard of living in order for an industrial revolution to take off. What did I say? Fuel, cheap labor, and you need money, lots of money. You need what we might call entrepreneur or money you're willing to risk. You have so much money that you can risk that amount of money. And what I mean by that is, quick example, the idea that if you have $100 million and you say, okay, I'm going to risk 10 million of that in order to make another 100 million. You need that kind of money. And of course, if you lose, you still got 90 million. So the point is, you've got a lot of extra income. In the 18th century in Great Britain, these things all came together. Fuel, primarily coal. Pretty much anywhere you want to dig in Britain, you're going to find coal. Money. Britain, and we're going to be talking about slavery later on in this class, but Britain was the largest slave trading nation in the world in the 18th century. The beginning of the 18th century, there was an anti-slavery movement in Britain, but it had very few followers and very little support. During the 18th century, much of the slave trade in Britain and the profits from the slave trade went into the Industrial Revolution. So the profits from the slave trade go into the Industrial Revolution. By the end of the 18th century, the anti-slavery movement was very strong. In fact, so strong that Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807. Now, one would like to think that the British had come to the senses or found some kind of new moral ground. But in a more cynical approach, view, of course, by the end of the 18th century, British, the grandsons of the once profitable and rich slave owners, slave traders, had now become owners of industries. So they were using the profits from their great grandfathers and fathers, investing in the Industrial Revolution. By the end of the 18th century, they could afford to be moral and could afford to stand up and say the end of the slave trade. Now, industrialization comes about because of technological advancement. In the 18th century, beginning of the 18th century, Britain was essentially a farming industry, very limited skills, very little industry going on. But what happens is if one technological innovation takes place, it can often antiquate everything else that has to do with the process of creating an item. For instance, if you want to make a shirt, and you start off, you got yourself a spinning wheel, you've got yourself a loom, you take raw cotton, you shove it in the box, you spin it, thread comes out, you put it in a ball, you eventually get to a weaving machine, you eventually weave that into cloth, and that cloth, of course, is dyed and cut and turned into a shirt. It's a long process. But if you've got a machine that suddenly can produce more, can create, for instance, a lot more thread, instead of producing what you produce in one day with a human, you can produce 100 times that with a machine. Well, suddenly you can produce a lot of thread, but the old other machines, they're still dealing with the old standards, so they all have to be updated. Example is the laptop computer. If you suddenly came up with an innovation, a new keyboard that just did everything beyond anything else a contemporary laptop could do, well, all the other parts of the laptop would have to be updated. That's exactly what happens in the 18th century. The spinning jenny, a machine-driven spinning wheel, that could be, you could have 10 or 100 connected to horsepower or animal power or water or wind. A spinning jenny allowed you to produce a lot more thread. Well, when that happened, then you had to have better weavers and better dyeing. So now in the 18th century, the first industry in the Industrial Revolution is the textile industry, the making of cloth, the making of clothing. Britain begins to mass produce these items. But of course, now you've got yourself a problem. And most of the Industrial Revolution, it really is a result of practical need. What's the next thing you're going to do? I can mass produce 10,000 shirts, but how am I going to sell these shirts? Well, I got to get them to market. How are you going to get them to market? What enables people now to travel and transport these items all over the world is going to be initially the steam engine. Now, the steam engine has been around for a very long time. And since the time of the Romans, essentially, you burn something, you boil water, you create steam. That steam can be sent in different directions, and it can be used to move things. But in the 18th century, a man named James Watt, W-A-T-T, is credited with perfecting the steam engine, making it something effective, making it essentially portable power. You take a steam engine anywhere you want to set it up. As long as you got fuel for it, you've got power. And that power can be used to move machines. It can be attached to an axle that will create a steamship or a steam engine for trains, or create steamships for traveling all over the world. Now you've got a means by which to transport these goods that you are mass producing. The second major industry in the Industrial Revolution is the railroad. The railroad. Now, by the beginning of the 19th century, Britain had begun to import its goods all over the world. It had the largest navy in the world. It invested its money into mass producing and selling these items. There were, however, already some major problems occurring. The problem with the Industrial Revolution, at least in the 18th, early 19th century, maybe late to the 19th century, was there really no regulations. There really were no rules. Everyone was just pretty much doing what they wanted to do, which meant, of course, that it was everyone for themselves. And immediately you began to see many social problems occur. Britain, of course, being the first industrialized nation in the world, sees the first major problems. These problems, specifically, three main ones, were drunkenness, alcoholism, drunkenness at an extremely high rate. We often talk about medieval Europe and people drinking alcohol rather than water because it was healthier. Yeah, but they had never seen the level of drunkenness you saw in Victorian England. You began to see a huge rise in prostitution throughout the country. And pollution, massive amounts of pollution. We often talk about foggy London, but it's really not foggy London, it's smoggy London. They were burning coal by the tons, coal that was creating smog all over the country. And of course, you have the rise of these new industries. Well, new industries based on using chemicals, based on using machines, oils, and you had a lot of byproducts, a lot of waste. What do you do with this byproducts and waste? Well, out of sight, out of mind. The easy solution is to throw it in a river. It floats away and it's gone. Well, we know that garbage never goes anywhere. It's going to be someplace and it's going to be a problem. You had suburban blight. People were put up in tenements, these buildings for workers to live in. No running water, very few accommodations, places where people lived in poverty and were paid very little. And lived in very rough conditions. I mentioned prostitution. We often have these ideas, often depicted by Hollywood as the prostitute with a heart of gold, or the Victorian prostitute suddenly breaks into song someplace. Please understand, Victorian England, 19th century England, and prostitutes. The average age for a prostitute in Victorian England was somewhere in the early 40s. Many of them were or had been married. Many of them were homeless. We're talking about women and some men who simply had nowhere to go, nothing else that could save them. There was no social net. There was nothing to save people if they fell apart. And of course, because there were no regulations and no protections, even if you had a husband working in a factory, or you were working in a factory, if you lost a hand, you lost a finger in one of these very unsafe machines, what did you get? You got, thank you very much, here's your hand if we can find it. And they sent you out the back door. Drunkenness. Now, this is always an interesting one because if you think about it for a moment, we had a very, very high level of drunkenness throughout Europe, and England. And of course, you can assume one reason for that is if you're working 14 hours a day in a shitty job, and you come home, you're going to want to get drunk. I mean, you're getting paid very little. You live in a slum someplace. But it kind of begs the question that if you're getting paid so little, where does the money come from? How are you be able to afford to get drunk? One of the reasons for that, of course, is because alcohol was subsidized, particularly rum and gin. The government made sure that alcohol was subsidized. Why? Well, guys, in any country where you have the potential for revolution, you are going to have some kind of easy drug available, some kind, somehow. I remember I used to teach in Minsk, in Belarusia, and teachers there got paid $25 a month. It's a old Stalin estate, really, it still is. And they would complain to me and say 2 bottles of Russian vodka it costs less than a loaf of bread. Why? Well, because if people are drunk or they're high or whatever, they're not leading revolutions. So one reason why drunkenness was, of course, so rampant is because alcohol was subsidized. Now, I mentioned earlier cheap labor. Where are all these people coming from? Well, in the 18th century, most people in England lived off the land, right? Throughout the world and in England. And if you went to your usual or your normal English community, what you would find is a village, usually with a couple of churches, maybe a couple of pubs, and you would find these tiny little farms all over the land. And somewhere you'd have the nobility with their big estates, and then you'd have a plot of land called the commons. Now, the commons were an area where people could use them if they wanted to do something extra. You want to raise more sheep, cattle, you want to grow things. Commons were available to everyone. They're the commons. In the 18th century, the British government decided to sell the commons to the aristocracy. The idea being that the land would be better used, more efficiently used, if it was used by the few. That was the argument. And in fact, to a point, that was probably true. The land was more efficiently used. The problem was that many of these English farmers, small farmers who had maybe 1/10 of an acre and a family of 4 or 5 kids, they couldn't afford to live on this plot of land, and they no longer had the commons available. So these farmers then were forced off the land and into the cities. And when they got to the cities, they became the labor for the new industries. This is called the enclosure movement of the 18th century, or the enclosure acts of the 18th century. And there were, easy number to remember, 1,776 enclosure acts in the 18th century that drove the people off the land and into the cities, selling the land off to the nobility, so that the people ended up either becoming servants, right, many more servants than there had been in the 18th, 19th century for the nobility, or they went to the cities, and in the cities they became cheap labor for factories. All of these problems were creating a lot of issues, environmental issues, social issues. There were a few that were getting extremely rewarded by this. There's no question about this. And the Industrial Revolution will have many positive effects on Western culture. It's certainly, we live longer, we have many things available to us, and the standard of living has risen. in many ways. But the downside was that we kind of lost our touch, our connection, certainly one of the important downsides, with nature. We no longer had a connection with nature. We'll talk about that in the next one.